It's time to get the story behind the story. Interviews with newsmakers, news breakers, and Vermonters making a difference. WCAX presents 802 News with Mark Johnson. Here's Mark.
Ellen Kahler has been the executive director of the Vermont Sustainable Jobs Fund since 2005. Among the projects she's overseen is the state's highly successful Farm to Plate program. She was recently inducted into the Vermont Agricultural Hall of Fame as an innovator who has, quote, demonstrated a fresh and forward-thinking approach to agriculture. We'll begin our discussion with Ellen Kahler after a word from our sponsor, Red Hen Baking Company. At Red Hen Baking Company, they believe pure, uncomplicated ingredients in the hands of skilled artisans are the building blocks for great food. They're dedicated to creating the best food from the best ingredients. You'll find an ever-changing lineup of delicious pastries, sandwiches, and soups at their beautiful cafe off Route 2 in Middlesex, just off I-89. Their breads are also available in many other locations. Led by owners Randy George and Eliza Kane, Red Hen Baking Company has been on the leading edge of the local food movement since 1999. You're just back from the Vermont Farm Show.
Yeah.
Got a big... You didn't get the Lifetime Achievement Award, which I guess is a good sign, right? You got the Agriculture Innovator, and that was largely for your work with the Farm to Plate program. So let's start with telling people, what is the Farm to Plate program?
Sure. Well, unbelievably, in 2009, so 15 years ago, the Vermont legislature was thinking about how can we advance all of the different types of agricultural activity that's going on. You might remember back in 2009, we had the Great Recession was going on. The dairy industry was really struggling. There was really big price downturns that they were receiving. And yet at the same time, we had this unbelievable energy happening with CSAs and farmers markets and farm to school and farm to table cuisine and such. And so the legislators were looking at challenges with the dairy industry being in the toilet, and then looking at all of this other stuff going on that was so different. And they said, what's going on? And they just wanted to understand. And so we were tasked at the Sustainable Jobs Fund, we were tasked in statute with developing a 10-year strategic plan, and it was called the Farm to Plate Investment Program. So we call it Vermont Farm to Plate. And we conducted an 18-month engagement process with all sorts of folks all over the state. About 1,500 Vermonters weighed in, and we developed this 10-year plan, and then we set about implementing it. So we created what's known as the Farm to Plate Network. We set up groups that are multiple organizations at a time, places like the Intervale and NOFA and Extension and the Agency of Agriculture and a whole bunch of farms, food business owners, distributors, grocers, all working together to try to strengthen Vermont's food system.
Give me an example or two.
Well, for instance, in the early years of the Farm to Plate Network, one of the things that people were really worried about was we had a lot of livestock producers who really struggled to get their animals harvested throughout the year and had to wait a long time to get slaughter slots. And so oftentimes what ends up happening is you look at that as a problem and you're like, oh, well, we need more slaughterhouses. And then you spend a lot of money, but public and private, to create more slaughterhouses. But what we wanted to do was to back up and say, well, is that really the problem? So we pulled together livestock producers, chefs, slaughter and meat processors, distributors, retail meat butcher counter folks, service providers, capital providers, so everybody that is a stakeholder in the meat supply chain. And we said, let's figure out what's really going on here. We did a bunch of research, talked to everybody, really found out that the problem was that there weren't enough meat cutters and there wasn't enough processing capacity, storage capacity. So animals could get slaughtered, but then it takes time for them to hang, to be cut up properly, to be packaged, to be then shipped out. So what we found out was that there was this bottleneck at a certain point in the supply chain that was not initially obvious. So what that meant then was the private sector folks that are in the slaughter and meat processing world be like, oh, all right, yes, that is what's really going on here. So then you saw major investments happening, like the Vermont Packing House. Mark Curran, who was running Black River Produce, created Black River Meats, and he bought the old Ben & Jerry's plant, Peace Pop plant down in North Springfield, and created Vermont Packing House with another Minnesota company. This was a joint venture. And so it added a new capacity. And all of a sudden, now there were enough slaughter slots. And so we had built out the processing capacity enough where there was more of a balance between livestock needing to be processed and the processing capacity to do that. Now, interestingly, probably 8 years later, we're back in a similar situation. And that's what happens. The dynamism of the marketplace of supply and demand is never static. So you increase your supply of animals, and now you don't have enough processing capacity. You add more processing capacity, and now you don't have enough animals going through. So that's sort of a dynamic that just happens, right? But if you're not paying attention to those dynamics and really understanding what's underneath those dynamics, you could waste a lot of time and money investing in things that you don't really need and miss what you do really need.
And wasn't this when you also had this mobile unit that was going around? You had a mobile slaughter?
Yeah, back, I think it was maybe 2009, 2010, the Agency of Agriculture actually put some funding forward to create a mobile processing unit for meat and for poultry and such. But the operator could never make the economics work. So it ultimately got sold to a farm, and I believe it's still being used. I actually don't know, but not as a mobile, but as a stationary unit.
Well, what's interesting about your answer on that, and it's part of the reason I wanted to talk to you, is that so many of the solutions, quote unquote, that we come up with are these top-down people in the legislature, and I don't mean this in a disrespectful way, or people that think that they know the answer, and then they try to implement it. And you actually went out and asked people, and it was more of a ground up than a top down.
Yeah, because these are all complex systems. And when you have a complex system, one of the definitions of that is that there is no one right answer. There isn't. It is complex for a reason. There's a lot of moving parts and pieces. And so what might on the surface be obvious as, oh, this is the obvious answer here, it's usually not. It's usually under that waterline. I like to use the analogy of an iceberg. And what you see at the very top above the waterline are sort of those events, the things that catch our eye. But when you go underneath the waterline, you go down farther and farther and farther, you actually get to structures and trends and even mental models that are really driving what's going on. So if you don't actually get underneath that waterline and really get down to more of the root causes of things, then you're just applying Band-Aids. You're not really solving the problem. The challenge that legislators and policymakers all across the country, I think, have these days is that the problems that we're all facing as in our society, in our economy, in our communities, are more and more complex, and they're overlapping.
Right.
So you have the housing crisis with the childcare crisis, with the lack of a labor force, with supply chain breakages, with an aging demographic. Like, each one of them in itself is complex.
Right.
Now they intersect. Now you have to figure out, well then, wow, how do I actually, what strings shall I pull? Like, where should I apply pressure? What's the policy that we should be trying to enact? Because it's not just solving it for one, you have to solve it for all. And thus, there is no one right answer. Everybody's looking for the easy silver bullet, It just doesn't exist.
Well, and that's probably the problem with having politicians do it, because they have the next election that they're looking at, and people are looking for them to come up with a solution in a 2, 4, or whatever term period.
That's partly it, but honestly, I think, our legislators really try hard, and they're very good, well-meaning people, but they don't have staff. Really, right? They're not there full time, and they get paid peanuts.
Right.
So they come with a passion to try to want to help the people in their community. That's what motivates them. Because honestly, to go out door knocking, to try to sell yourself to get elected, you actually have to want to do something for other people. Otherwise, it's hard to keep that up. I would think that's why I've never run for office, 'cause
Yeah.
I don't really. But I think that they are challenged, and they rely on advocates, on lobbyists, on people who have real lived experience to come in and talk with them, because they don't have all the answers. And most of them don't have a lot of the any experience with the issues that are being presented to them. I mean, you take a look at the agenda in any given session of what's coming through the Commerce Department, let alone the Transportation Committee or the Agriculture Committees. I mean, they're all over the map. They're increasingly complex. And how are you supposed to know about all this?
Yeah. As somebody once said to me, they're not voting on should we sell liquor on Sundays anymore. These are, how do you solve the housing crisis? How do you solve the drug problem downtown? And you're right. I mean, they're all kind of interconnected. How did you learn, or where did you learn to look at these as complex systems and then know what to do when you figured that out? Where'd you learn that skill?
I think it just I learned it over time. It was just of interest to me. I think back on my childhood and coming up through high school and college, I always had big existential questions like, what's the meaning of life? Who am I? Where am I in this universe? What is this universe? I always had these kind of big questions that were always present for me. And so I think when you have those big questions, for me anyways, what it led to was asking the why, and that helps you to get down underneath at these root causes. I also got a real schooling when I was at the Peace and Justice Center because, we started off, anti-war stuff. We were working on Central America Solidarity. We were working on Save James Bay. We were working on GATT and NAFTA, global trade agreements, all of these things that we were against, right? And I woke up one day and I was just like, it's all about the economy. It's all about the way we've structured our economy to have this never-ending growth GDP and the ways in which the inequities of our economic system were starting to really play out in the post-Reagan era. And so what we're seeing today, I think, of the challenges that we're facing, these complex systems, are kind of the chicken has come home to roost. The supply side economics of the Reagan era just really didn't work for the average American. Mm-hmm. And that income inequality, I think, has led us to be in this very scarcity mindset and not having, and a lot of losing that social contract of how we take care of each other, how we're there for each other. And I'm talking broadly because I think in Vermont, especially when we have the flooding that we have, we see how Vermonters come out in full force to help neighbors, right? We do that for each other still in Vermont. I'm talking about other parts of the country where that's less the case unless you have a natural disaster. Neighbors know each other here still in Vermont a good bit. I know all of my neighbors where I live in my rural town of Starksboro, for instance, and I'm very close with them. And even if you're have a half a mile away from each other, like we take care of each other's pets when they go away, you just do things for people in your neighborhood. So that connectivity is still there. But I think that a lot of what has happened with these income inequalities, people have gotten more isolated. You have these issues around a lot of loneliness and people wanting to be happy, but not knowing how. And I just buy this one more thing, or if I just get one more selfie that people like my social media post, 5 times more than the last one, like that's gonna bring me happiness. And I don't buy that. And so because of those bigger questions, I keep always trying to understand the why, what's underneath all of that, what's really driving that. And I think over time I've just wired my brain that way, and I just look at the world that way and think about those things.
I remember when James Carville had that great line, it's the economy, stupid. Yeah. You're credited in part for helping local consumption of local production go from 5 to 16%. Do you consider first of all, what does that mean? And do you consider that, is that good or is that bad, or how do you view that?
Yeah. I like to think of it as good. When we created the first Farm to Plate strategic plan, one of the questions is always, well, how big is Vermont's food system to start with, right? How much are we producing? How much are we consuming? And so at that time, in 2011, actually, when we really dove in and took a look at it, we developed a methodology for actually counting local food consumption in Vermont. We estimated about 5% was local food consumption. And a lot of people were surprised at that. They thought it was more. I think it was a conservative number, but that's all we could actually count using existing data and then making some other educated estimates, right? So what we did with the first strategic plan was we said, well, let's double that. Let's get to 10% within 10 years. There was some pushback. There were some people who were like, well, let's go to 30%. Let's go to 50%. And I was like, no, let's just go 10%. Let's just see about doubling.
Let's get a win.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So we set that as a target for 2020. So then as we were implementing the plan, we kept a lot of data that we were tracking over time and helping people to better understand data so that they could feel more confident with understanding how is the marketplace actually working? Is it working for our producers? And different sized producers, for instance, how are they doing? How is the marketplace working for like the direct markets with farmers markets and CSAs? We hit a certain point in the mid-teens where farmers that were selling exclusively to those types of markets felt like the sales were down and they weren't really going to the farmers markets as much, maybe because of convenience or maybe oversaturation was what was being said. So, things are just always changing. Nothing is going to stay the same way. So you have to keep evolving. And so every 3 years, we would run this local food counts again. And we would reach out to the hospitals and the schools and the university, UVM, Sodexo, their account managers, and to distributors and grocers. And we'd ask them for their data. So we would maintain this count. We did this 4 times over a 10-year period. And that's how we arrived at that we think we achieved 16%. Now, so what that means is from a dollar value is $114 million in local food sales is what we started with in essence 2011. We got to $371 million in 10 years. Wow. So the percentage in some ways is an easier way to get your head around something, but the dollar values is really impactful because that's money in our farmers and food producers' pockets.
Darn right.
Right? And that's an awful lot of young people learning about local food. That's an awful lot of multiplier effect of dollars staying in our communities instead of going out to California or Mexico. So we've been promoting this notion of, over the course of your week or your month or your year, think about your purchasing. We're not saying you have to only go 100% Vermont products. You can if you want. We have pretty much almost everything except like bananas and coffee and chocolate, oranges. But we produce
we have chocolate, don't we? Yeah.
Well, yes, but not originally. Okay. The cocoa beans are grown.
Fair enough.
Yes, but so the point is that we are so blessed, right? We have so many amazing producers. We actually have the ability to source for ourselves in our homes or go out to restaurants that are farm-to-table genre restaurants or go to our schools or at the hospital. Their local food procurement at the hospital is incredible, right? So we have more and more opportunities, and people have gotten excited about it. So then that sort of reinforces. Everyone's like, oh, yeah, I want in. This is good. This is good. It tastes better. It's fresher. It lasts longer in the fridge, right? Then when you have a target like that, people want to reach it. We got to 10% actually in 7 years, so 3 years earlier than planned. Now, interestingly, no other state had replicated our methodology, even though it was peer-reviewed. We said, look, we want others to do this in your state. But I finally, in this last year, we got the other 5 New England states to do the local food counts in their states. And on September 10th, we're going to release the results of that. So we'll be able to actually have a New England number, much less percentage than Vermont, but they're much bigger populations. So their dollar numbers, their dollar sales is like so much more than Vermont.
And why is Vermont doing better?
I think because we've been organized, we've been more aligned, we've had a legislatively requested strategic plan, we've had the Agency of Agriculture and all of their staff totally focused on it, the legislature's focused on it. We have 350 plus organizations that are part of this network. Like, it's just, again, kind of like because we're small, we can make bigger things happen faster than they can in, say, Massachusetts, right? But if we're going to try to increase our regional food production and consumption, we're going to need Massachusetts and Connecticut eaters to buy more food from the region, including primarily Vermont farms and food producers, and as well as Mainers, because that's where the food production in the whole 6-state region happens.
Well, and maybe it's working, going back to what you said before, we all know each other better.
Yeah.
It's a little bit more, it's more local. You know the farmer down the street.
Yeah, and if you live in the rural area now, especially during COVID, we saw a real uptick in the number of farm stands, for instance, and people really liked stopping there. So farmers kept them up. So, it doesn't take much these days to drive some of the back roads, and you can find wonderful farm stands that are oftentimes have products from multiple farms and not just one farm.
I would, as I was listening to it, I was imagining that one of the biggest obstacles would have to be cost. I go into the co-op down here. I want to buy the local blueberries. Sometimes and it's not that they're expensive. It's that the food coming from other places is so cheap. And I can't, first of all, I can't figure out how they're able to do it. And I lean towards buying the local product. It's better. The blueberries are much bigger. They look fresher, all of that. And I want to support local farmers. But I would imagine that there are a lot of people that say $4.99 for a pint versus $8.99 for a pint. I got to go with the lesser one. How did you work that problem?
Well, one, everybody has their own food budget, and there's an awful lot of Vermonters who are food insecure and who or Vermonters that are on fixed incomes, and there is no way they will ever want to or be able to do $8.99 pint of something, right? That's just not possible, and that's okay. Like, we're not saying that everybody needs to. Like, we've set a target by 2030 to get to 25% local food consumption. So we're not saying that everybody has to spend 25% of your food dollars on local. That would be great if people could, but we know that's not possible. But someone maybe like me, I might be spending 50% of my food dollars on local, for instance, right? Yep. So it averages out is the point. They were all doing our part. We all do is what we can. Maybe it's you just only can buy Cabot butter. Or maybe it's that you get a local loaf of bread. Like, anything that you can do is better than not doing anything, right? So be part of this. Mm-hmm. But the other reason, sort of the behind the scenes of where the pricing issues are that you raise is, is that so much of our food that is coming from far away, the externalities of the cost of the delivery, the water issues in the West, because so much of our food comes from California and Mexico, and that those are not built into the price. They've been subsidized by our taxpayer dollars to these really large farms in faraway places. So they have, and a lot of their laborers are day laborers, or they might be migrant laborers, they might be undocumented laborers. So they're not being paid a livable wage. And then they're also producing at such a scale that their unit prices are going to be less per unit. Their water is subsidized because of the way the water rights in the West work, for instance. And they have a longer growing season, so they can actually have many crops, multiple type crops per season, right? So all of those things are kind of working against us here in the Northeast. We have a lot more rockier soils in Vermont, for instance. We have a lot of hills, right? There's not a lot of good river bottom land, and what we do is prone to flooding these days with climate change. We also don't have the migrant workforce, so we're paying Vermonters And even if those farms that have H-2A workers, they're still paying $14, $15 an hour by law. It just costs more to produce. The other thing is we really want to support our farmers to have a livable wage too. I mean, one of the things that was I think a shock for a lot of people when we released the first plan back in 2011 was how many farm families were not food secure. Even though they might be, very good dairy farmers and producing a lot of fluid milk, all that milk was leaving the farm to go get processed elsewhere. And other than having, their backyard gardens, they didn't have a lot of cash to then spend on a lot of other food. So often a lot of farm families are really struggling. And so it is bigger. That's why we have to take really a whole systems view of this, because we're seeing with climate change, for instance, we are getting slightly longer growing seasons. More farmers are starting to put things under cover and trying to have season extension. All of those activities then are helping to keep local food more year-round available to us. And then, it's supply and demand too. We have to, as consumers, need to say, I want this. And then the producers it'll be easier for them to say, okay, I'm going to expand, I'm going to add this, I'm going to put on this extra storage unit, I'm going to buy that extra tractor, I'm going to make the go of it. Like, that's where the supply and demand balance comes in.
How do you motivate? I can understand what you're talking about with an individual. How do you motivate somebody like the purchaser at the University of Vermont or at the medical center to go this route where cost is really important for them and it's a larger scale?
It's a good question. Actually, some of this we've been lucky because we've had some really amazing people at the University of Vermont Medical Center. For instance, Diane Emery ran the nutrition department for so many years. And she and the chefs there worked really hard to get more local foods sourced in. And she has been a leader with the other hospitals in the state. So when you think about it, though, an individual hospital has what's called mainline contracts with like Sedex, with Cisco, for instance, and U.S. Foods. These are big broadline distributors.
Yeah.
And they have these contracts that say, well, you get a discount if you buy like 95% of the food off of our trucks. So if those distributors don't actually have local products, you're kind of out of luck. Right, as someone that even if you want to buy source, you're boxed in. So what Diane and this has also happened with UVM Sodexo, because they made a commitment to get to 20% local and regional source food for in their dining halls and stuff, is to be selective. To be like, okay, what could I buy? Oh, instead of buying pre-chopped up squash from U.S. Foods from who knows where, I'm going to contract with a local farmer and I'm going to get whole squash, a whole year's supply, and I'm going to have my chefs take a period of time and they're going to cut it all up and they're going to freeze it and we're going to have it for the year. Right? So you do some of that pre-processing work. Or I'm going to commit to buying a certain percentage of our chicken being from local, or I'm gonna really work hard during the season in the summer months. I'm gonna get all of our lettuce from these local farms. So again, it's not necessarily has to be all in 100% year round, but it's every bit helps, right? Sodexo actually had an agreement with the University of Vermont. They signed sort of an MOU saying we're going to commit to 20%. They hired somebody whose job it is to do that sourcing, build relationships with producers, and have agreements that, okay, you grow these 5 crops, we will buy them from you, right? And that's not to say that there hasn't been struggles along the way. They would like to buy more, and sometimes they can't get everything that they want. They're not going to be able to sell lots of local product if you've got a meal plan and they have to keep the cost of that meal plan to $2 a plate. But in all of their retail outlets where they can, your grab and go, like they can make sure that there are Vermont apples. They can make sure there's Garuka bars there. There's lots of ways they can make sure that it's always Vermont dairy and Vermont yogurt in the coolers, or aqua vitae kombucha. Like there's ways that you can do it. You just have to think it through and make the effort and say, I really want to do this. And we've been really fortunate in Vermont that we've had a lot of those kinds of folks. And I will say that local food sourcing in institutions like schools, like hospitals, like colleges is really important from an equity perspective, because about a quarter of our population will go through a hospital or a university or a K through 12 school in a given year. Mm-hmm. So in terms of being able to provide opportunities for people to consume local food, institutional market channel is one of the best we have. It is overall a small portion of where people get their food, but it still is important from an equity perspective nonetheless.
Is trying to get from 16 up to 25, is this a little bit like a reverse when people try to lose weight, that the first 10 pounds is easy, but that last 4 or 5? Is it going to be increasingly more difficult to get to that than it was to get from, 6 to 15? 15 to 25 will be harder?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I think so, because something like 70% of all the food we consume comes from grocery stores or restaurants, like the fast food or whatever. So that means in order for people to even consume that food, we have to be able to get more local product into our grocery stores. Now in Vermont, we're really lucky because we have a lot of independently owned grocery stores still. Mm-hmm. So, you have the Shelburne Market and the Jericho Market and the Richmond Market, and you have our food co-ops across the state. They do an incredible amount of local food sales, like way and above. Like I think in season, I don't know the most latest percentages, but it was not unusual for City Market or the Hunger Mountain Co-op in Montpelier to be doing between 30 and 40% local products in their stores. Wow. Especially at the height of the season. It might drop off a little bit in the hardest part of winter, but they are really committed to buying from local producers. The benefit to the producers also is that they're not trying to force down the cost and have the producers take whatever those stores want to pay for that, right? They're more in a relationship with their producers, and so that's another reason why some of the costs are higher, is because there's more of the actual money that it costs to produce the food staying with the farmer, the producer of that food. Whereas a big Walmart or these big national chains,
Costco,
they're all pushing the cost, the price down, and forcing producers. You want to sell into this market, then we're going to tell you what we're willing to pay for that. Oh, and by the way, if it goes bad, you're going to pay for that. We're not covering the cost of spoilage, or if we need to discount something and put something on sale to move it, you're going to pay for that. We're not going to pay for that. Mm-hmm. So that's another part of it. So yes, I think in order for us to get to 25%, we have to get more local product into our local independently owned stores and co-ops as the best source, as well as institutions. Keep making a move on that. Hannaford grocery store chain, they're based out of Maine, but they're owned by a Dutch company called Ahold Delhaize. But they have a local food program, and Market 32 is starting to try to do more as well. So as the grocery market is so competitive, and there's been so much consolidation over the last 10 years, which is why it's going to be harder, because that consolidation pressure and that competition makes things really challenging. So one of the opportunities, I think, for the independents is also to differentiate themselves. They are more connected to their community. That as producers, they can have a relationship with that local store more, so that they can have more understanding of the ebbs and flows of what it's like to be in farming or food production, where sometimes things are, the weather happens. It's out of your hands, right? And so we actually, one of the things we've done in Farm to Plate is we've had a retail grocer training program that we've offered for free to independently owned grocery stores and co-ops to help them improve their merchandising, to learn about how best to source as well as sell local food, how to promote it, how to sign it so that people know that, oh, wow, that is local. I could buy that. And I think those kinds of activities it takes a lot of effort. It takes a long time because we're fighting an uphill battle against,
The
Stop
man.
and Shop and,
Yeah.
and Albertsons and Kroger's trying to merge, to be the largest grocery store chain in the country. Like, that's what we're up against.
What in this effort has been a spectacular failure? I mean, we learned from our failures, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
And one of the things that we've always really baked into Farm to Plate is to have reflection periods and to adjust and learn and constantly evolve things, which is why it's hard for me to answer that question, because we are constantly evaluating things and changing course as needed, right? That's a lot of what systems change work is about, is you probe, you test, you try things out, but then if it's not working, you pivot and you try this other thing, because again, there's no one right answer. I don't know that I would say that there's a failure. It's more like I wish we would have been able to go even farther faster. We still are losing too much farmland to development. We still have, we're losing a lot of young people who don't want to stay in farming, that grew up in farm families. We've lost a lot of dairy farms, although we still have almost all the same, the volume of milk being produced in cows and stuff. But, we've lost a lot of that infrastructure. And a lot of this is forces beyond our control. Like, no matter what we would have done with our Farm to Plate efforts, some of this is really, truly out of our control. They're global forces or national forces. But I would say that if there's an area that's been frustrating, that's just starting to shift a little bit finally, has been with the other 5 New England states. I've been working with my counterparts in the other New England states since 2012, trying to help them to want to develop a strategic plan and have a network of people working on things. And there's been little efforts here and there, but it hasn't been at the level and scale as I had, and as fast as I had hoped it would be. That's starting to change now, which I'm very excited about. We just produced. There's a group of us that's called the New England Food System Planners Partnership, and representing all 6 states. And the ag departments now, their staff of all 6 states have joined us as well. And we published some foundational research last year called New England Feeding New England. And we set a target of reaching 30% regional production for regional consumption of food. That's a big lift for the region to do collectively. But I'm starting to see signs that there's real traction and people are getting really excited about this. And I think that's in part because of what they saw happening during the pandemic with the supply chain fragility and a lot of supply chains that broke down and store shelves that were empty for days, which we had never seen before. And people learning more about supply chains and how fragile they can be and how everything being so consolidated makes things very vulnerable. And that is really, I think, helping to wake people up to the fact that we need to be more self-reliant as a region, as a New England region, to be more self-reliant, to be able to take care of ourselves, right? Just how we think about it in Vermont, we take care of each other. Well, how do we start thinking and acting more like a New England region? The benefit is most of the food that's produced and sold in the region is coming from Vermont and Maine. Most of the eaters, the big population centers, are in southern New England. So how do we get southern New Englanders to care about us up here in Vermont and in Maine and our producers, and vice versa? How do we look for these opportunities, not just to sell product in Vermont, but to start going more and more across the border? And by the way, that going back to the price of food, a lot of southern New Englanders have more disposable income, so they could actually pay a higher price. And for producers, it's being smart about how do you think about differentiating which markets you sell which products to. If you're a chicken producer and you know what you can get for a chicken breast, for instance, versus chicken legs versus chicken thighs, maybe you sell the chicken breasts to the higher end food co-ops and stores where higher income folks, because they're willing to pay for that, the cost of that chicken, but you sell the drumsticks to the schools. that have a more limited budget. But you're still, you're as the producer, they all averaging out to what you ultimately need for that whole chicken that you've just sold, for instance. There's 1 million people in our 6 states who are employed in the food system. It represents 10% of our private sector sales, of actually the state gross product in all of our states. 10% is coming from the food system in some way, shape, or form. So it's a big part of our economy. It's a big part of our workforce, and we all have to eat. So where do you want your food to come from? How could we get to 30% regionally produced food for regional consumption, meaning that we keep more of what we produce here and sell it in the region? And we also need to expand. We need to actually add close to 1 million more acres across the 6 states in order to be able to achieve that 30% goal from the calculations that we were able to do.
See, my vision is about out to like next Tuesday. That's about as far out as I can go. You mentioned, we've talked about the UVM Medical Center in the school. And I know there's been an effort to get it into the local schools. How successful has that been?
Oh, it's been hugely successful. I mean, Megan Camp and folks at Shelburne Farms, they are managing the Farm to School network. So they have a whole network of just Farm to School folks. They have a Farm to School Institute where they're training teachers to be able to teach about where food comes from and learn about exercises like doing taste testing and recipe development. And then they also work with cafeteria directors around sourcing local food, how they can prepare more local food, whether it's having a salad bar with all fresh product or be able to make some of their own lightly processed foods by buying things that are larger and then cutting them up and freezing them or storing them in some way. So there's a lot of supports, and actually the legislature appropriates a certain amount every year for farm to school grants. The agency and the farm to school community then distribute little small grants, but sometimes it buys an oven or it buys a new cooler or it buys something for the kitchen that is about trying to improve the infrastructure so that they can have more local food in the schools. We've made big progress. I think it's something at least like 75% of schools have some amount of a local farm-to-school component, right? It's not just the cafeteria, it's actually also the classroom and having relationships with local producers and farmers that come onto the campus, or sometimes they have actual gardens on campus that the students are planting and doing all the weeding and harvesting and everything like that.
So you have this goal now. You want to go from 16% to 25%. Mm-hmm. How do you set the course? How do you build the roadmap to do that?
Sure. I mean, we started from the very, very beginning back in 2009 with developing a diagram that was a circle that to try to help people understand what makes up a food system, right? Because back then, most people, you use the word agriculture and they just think dairy farms or some other kind of production. And what we were tasked with doing by the legislature was developing the food system, which comprises farm inputs, production, processing, wholesale distribution, retailing, selling into grocery stores and such, and then also nutrient management and composting that goes back as farm input. So it's a full circle. So when we developed this diagram, we put in the middle of this circle of the components of the supply chain farm and food enterprises, because our feeling was without farms and food businesses, you're never going to have the food that gets produced and gets processed and gets sold and gets consumed and turned back into compost ultimately. And then outside that most outside ring are all the support systems, lenders, regulators, legislature, nonprofit organizations, technical assistance service providers, all who exist to support the businesses that are the food producers. And so when you take that initial view, say, well, this is the universe, in essence, right, of the food system. And then you start talking to everybody like we did, and we say, well, what are the bottlenecks? What's not working? What challenges are you facing? What's working well? What do you wish you could do more of? You start to hear then what people's responses are, and you start connecting the dots. You start seeing patterns of, like, it's really difficult to know. I want to sell to the university, but I don't know how. And you hear that enough times, like we did, and then we're like, I wonder what the barrier is. That, like, how does Sodexo source in local product? So in 2012, we asked them, and they said, well, let's have a forum. Let's pull together. We'll put all our cards on the table. We'll tell you exactly how we do contracting. This is how, if you want to be an approved vendor to sell to Sodexo, we'll tell you how that happens. But you, Farm to Plate, you bring farmers and other kinds of food manufacturers who are interested in selling to us, and we'll have a dialogue. So we did that in 2012. And that really, all of a sudden, the rules, in quotes, the rules of the game, sort of how it is that you could get your farm or your food business to be able to be a qualified vendor to sell to Sodexo through all of their university accounts. There are things you have to do, and it can take about a year to get approved. Most producers have no idea about that, right? So part of it is the systems development work is, again, asking those questions. Well, what's in the way? What are the bottlenecks? And then you do problem solving. But you don't just do it on your own. You do it with the people who are experiencing the challenges. Because we're not doing this as just our own small organization. We're doing it with so many other organizations. Everybody has their own eyes and their own ears and their own experience about what they're seeing that's not working or where there's opportunities to take advantage of. So more minds on this allows for more creative solutions and problem solving to happen. And then people get excited about that, and they raise the funds, or they go make something happen, or they make the investment, and then things just start to pick up momentum.
And then they're invested in a way too. I mean, it seems to me that that's a really important part of it. What do you know? I mean, you mentioned some of your earlier work. You worked at the Vermont Peace and Justice Center. You also did some work with, that's our commentator on this side here. So, you did this work with Doug Hoffer. He's now the state auditor on the livable wage. This is one of these questions, but what do you know now that you wish you'd known back then?
I wish that I knew more about how difficult it is for people who are in decision-making positions to really understand data to inform their decisions. Even really super smart people, we're just not, as a society, trained to really understand data. We have to, and so you have to be able to explain things in a way that's accessible to people. And so I think that's why when Doug Hoffer was running the numbers for what is the basic needs and what is the livable wage, I was the one that went out and sold it, so to speak. I was the one doing the storytelling. I was the one explaining what the data meant, not Doug so much. Doug did in the legislature afterwards, but I was the one that was helping to make it more accessible to people. And if you can design workshops and interactions so that people can feel what that data means in their own lives, then it's easier for them to understand what that data means. We have found, like, we've been doing a lot with Farm to Plate to just make the data available, with the hope that more people will find it and they will be able to figure out, and we explain it. It's not like we're just putting it out there with nice graphics and then just not explaining what it means. But even with explaining what it means, people have not really been trained in then, well, what do I do with this? How does this inform what I might do with my business? And it's not that they can't. I guess that's more like, I wish we had more ability to provide that training for folks to more people so they could really take advantage of the data. Because, you know full well, information is power, right? And so much of what the way the food system has evolved over the last 50, 60 years has been to basically put up a very thick black curtain where all the real information about how the system really works is behind that curtain. And it's known by actually a very small number of firms. And they're the ones that have the paid lobbyists in Washington. They're the ones that help to do the rulemaking with the FDA and with the USDA. And it's all to benefit these really super large corporations and screw the small producers. So one of the things that we've always felt was our job with Farm to Plate was to help make what is otherwise invisible visible, because knowledge and information is power. So the data that we present and the way that we talk about how the food system works is meant to provide more intel and knowledge to producers so that they can make even better decisions and think about how they can take advantage of the marketplace and the opportunities that are out there for them.
You've won a lot of awards. You just won another one today. You're an innovator too. Is that how you describe yourself?
I don't know. I just really love what I do, and I do what I love. I'm so interested in how things work and how things don't work, and I love solving problems, and I love working on big gnarly issues, and I love to think in systems, and so I just feel so grateful and so lucky that I get to do the work that I get to do every day. My wife will tell you that I work way too much, but I wouldn't do it if I didn't love it, and I'm happy doing it. It brings me a lot of joy.
Here's my last question. So what are you having for dinner?
I'm gonna make some fish tacos. Actually, I'm gonna take some masa harina, ground up corn, and make some fresh tortillas. And I bought some haddock that comes from someplace in New England that I bought at the Shelburne Market yesterday. And I'm going to take some nitty-gritty corn flour from Nitty Gritty Grains and some King Arthur flour. I'm going to batter that up, and I'm going to make some fish tacos for dinner with some Napa cabbage that I'm going to go out to the food co-op and buy to top it off.
That wraps it up for this edition of 802 News, sponsored by Red Ham Baking Company. Thanks for listening.